Morning. It is Sunday, April 16th, and I can't believe that I'm having to do something like this. Um, this unfortunate thing that keeps happening in our political discourse. We get so focused on some arbitrary arguments about rhetoric or what things are or what they're not that what ends up getting obscured, as always, is the actual danger that we are facing. So here I am, Sunday morning, drinking a cup of coffee, absolutely trying to enjoy a quiet morning without getting absolutely incensed about yet another moderate telling us, "Hey, you're out there. You are just alarming people, and you really don't have a good grasp on it. You should probably leave it to the experts." And then, of course, because social media works in this way, the discourse over all of it is just an absolute mess. There's no ability to have larger conversations about these things. And again, everything sort of gets devolved into a situation where all of a sudden you can't have larger conversations with the nuance and with the historical knowledge and the context. And it gets boiled down to, hey, listen, we're past Trump. Trump was the problem. Don't worry about it. Everything else will shake out in the end. I wanted to go ahead and do this video, and I opened it up live, completely, you know, unannounced, because I wanted to go ahead and have people, let them have some space if they wanted to join in on this conversation. I'm going to be disseminating this over the next week or so. So I want to get into a couple of questions that have been raised and that need addressed. First and foremost, is MAGA, the Trumpist movement, the Republican Party in its current iteration, the right wing, is it fascist? Now, to go ahead and define what fascist is, in order to have like a full conversation about it, we would have to go ahead and define fascism as a phenomenon that took place particularly in Western Europe in the early middle 20th century. Now, as we're having that conversation and as we're defining it, that's already a problem because it didn't just take place, of course, in Italy and Germany. It also gained traction in places like Spain, in Greece, but also in Great Britain, in the United States of America, in France. Fascism is a state of mind. Now, it was partially defined, and Danny Besner does a good job of talking about this. It was defined based on the trauma of World War One and all of that. So it has a militaristic sort of tinge to it. So that makes total sense. But we can't go ahead and just say that this is a thing that took place here. The label itself, of course, we can go ahead and say that this was fascistic, this was Nazistic, all of that. But to go ahead and take that tact is to take the awareness away of the fact that Nazism, fascism, these are expressions of an authoritarian mindset that is everywhere at all times. It is part of the human condition. It can be found in any nation. It can be found in any place. And by the way, it is accelerated by things like white supremacy and or weaponized religious mythologies and or cultural mythologies. Okay, so that being said, we also have to do away with the idea that that authoritarian mindset, particularly Nazism, fascism, that it was done away with by the end of World War II. Not true whatsoever. You can't destroy an ideology. Can't do it. There's no way, like you can't, and by the way, we learned this on the War on Terror. You can't just go around the world bombing people and then expecting them to suddenly change their minds. Not how any of this works. Also, it didn't help that the United States of America and its allies were like, hey, fascists, hey, Nazis, you want to help us go after the Soviet Union? We would love to have you. And as a result, we allowed it to continue. Then we also worked and partnered with those former fascists and those former Nazis in order to carry out things like Operation Condor around the world that went after leftists or social democrats or whatever you want to call them in order to make sure that the world would be center right or right wing or conservative. It's just the way that it happened, just the way that it worked. So, that being said, first things, when we get past these definitions, there's a reason that people like Tom Nichols will come out and say all of this stuff. And the reason is this, because Tom Nichols has been part of a conservative project for his entire professional life and wants to pretend that that conservative project doesn't have authoritarian tendencies. Everything was fine before Donald Trump came along. Never mind, of course, that Donald Trump is a symptom of a larger problem. Never mind that the election of 2000 was stolen using the Supreme Court. Never mind that the Republican Party has always played footsie with these white nationalist and white supremacist and white militia groups using the same conspiracy theories that fuel things like Trumpism and MAGA. The job that needs to be done, particularly with never Trump Republicans, is to pretend like this is just an aberration that is going to go away. He lost in 2020. If we can just get past 2024, matter of fact, if we can even bring in reasonable Republicans like Ron DeSantis, we can get away from this ugliness that has nothing to do with us. It has nothing to do with the project that we have had. It also hides something else about fascism and authoritarianism. It hides the fact that these moderates, that these conservatives, that they were the ones who welcomed fascism and Nazism. Did they think that Adolf Hitler was an absolute buffoon? Yeah, they absolutely did. They wish that Hitler would have calmed it down a little bit and maybe not ranted and raved. Maybe if they didn't wear the military uniforms and maybe if they didn't say some of the things they said about the Jews. But you know what? Deep down at the end of the day, they chose people like Adolf Hitler. And they chose them in order to combat, again, the left, socialist Democrats. And by the way, some of them even went in that direction as well. Communists, you name it. They went ahead and they said, you know what? They might be ugly, they might be violent, but there are ugly and violent people, and they'll go ahead and make sure to protect our power and our wealth. So, whenever we talk about fascism, whenever we talk about is it fascist, is it not fascist, we're always getting caught up in these stories that aren't necessarily true. We want to pretend that someone like an Adolf Hitler come along and hypnotize people with his amazing words, right? The speeches, they're too good. They're too good. How could anybody how could anybody hear it and not be influenced, right? It's sort of a magic. Instead, that's not true. It has everything to do with power and wealth and your position in society and wanting to protect it. Now, in this situation, is it the most accurate thing in the world to say that MAGA and the GOP and the current right wing authoritarian movement, is it the most accurate thing to say that it is fascist? Eh, this is something we could debate on for days and days and days. It is certainly fascistic. And while we're talking about the fact that it is fascistic, we also need to go ahead and talk about why this is its own thing. Because again, if you say Nazism, if you say fascism, you think about 20th century Western Europe. That is sort of the shortcut that we've gone ahead and created for ourselves. The chances here are that what is happening with MAGA, what is happening with Trumpism, what's happening with the Republican Party, what's happening with these authoritarian movements is it will eventually be known by its own name because they have these distinctive measures. That doesn't mean that they're not feeding off of fascism. It doesn't mean that they're not feeding off Nazism because they most certainly are. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. But I want to point out, as I've been saying, and I wrote about on Substack earlier this week. And if anybody wants to take a look at it, go over there and look at it. I went through the lens of the current Bud Light controversy, which sounds absurd on its face, but it was something that we needed to take a look at and we needed to examine further. Donald Trump has often been called a populist, meaning that he appeals to masses in order to create a base outside of party structures, all of that, or within party structures even. He's not. He's a faux populist. Donald Trump doesn't mean what he says. He never actually intended to make his supporters' lives better. He recognized an opportunity to capitalize off of an opening. He recognized that neither party was necessarily talking to a certain group of people who were incredibly pissed off and were not necessarily being communicated to or being offered advocacy outside of, some gestures here and there. He did it in order to make money. He did it in order to increase his brand. He did it in order to gain power. Now, that doesn't mean that what he has created doesn't have elements of populism to it. It does, but it's faux populistic. And within that faux populism, one of the things that's happening is that Trump and others like him who have made millions, if not tens of millions, hundreds of millions, maybe even billions of dollars off of making these appeals, they're faux appeals. The same way that happens within marketing, right? Go out and buy this big truck and you'll be a big, strong man. That's not real. That's a psychological appeal that allows people to capitalize off of insecurities. So, what has happened within the United States of America for decades, by the way, before Donald Trump ever came around, was an authoritarian, populistic, or faux populistic, fascistic appeal. It has been built up that all of these authoritarian instincts that are within people. And by the way, again, this isn't just a German problem. It's not just an Italian problem. It was around the world during the Great Depression. And by the way, prior to that, America has a long, long, and ugly tradition of authoritarian instincts and prejudices. And again, I talked about this in the Midnight Kingdom. I talked about this in American Rule. It's throughout. But what has happened is that these appeals, they stoke the same instincts within people, which are, I'm pissed off and I want somewhere to put it. Well, guess what? I'll give you a group of people to dislike: trans people, gay people, people of color, immigrants, you name it, right? I'll give you a group of people that you can push your anger towards. By the way, did I mention that we are in a cultural battle? We are in a social clash, and the clash between these cultures will give us meaning? That is the essence of fascism. The idea is that liberal democracy, liberalism, multiculturalism, tolerance, whatever you want to call it, that these things are dangerous. And by the way, they're being used by sinister forces out there in the dark. Jews, right? Communist, whoever you want to call it. That mindset, which was the basis of fascism and Nazism, is also the basis of these movements. It doesn't mean that everybody within them necessarily is a fascist or a Nazi, although they have the tendencies of fascists and Nazis, although they have the inclinations to talk like fascists and Nazis. They are on the same wavelength. By getting caught up in these linguistic and rhetorical decisions, what we're actually doing is obscuring that there is a larger human, political, socioeconomic crisis that has to be addressed. You and I can have this conversation on a Sunday. We can sit around and drink coffee and we can talk about this. The way that most people learn things is that they have labels that they go ahead and it says, "Oh, that's what that is. That's what happens with this." And whenever you talk about fascism, that is a streamlined way to explain to people exactly what's going on. It is an element of fascism. It is an American cousin of fascism. It is a very particular thing that is happening and is being stoked around the world by authoritarian movements that are helmed by some of the wealthiest few who recognize the ability to use fascistic appeals to win elections and to erode representative government that they see as impediments to their own wealth, but also authoritarians such as Vladimir Putin, Viktor Orban, who, by the way, are using a lot of their political capital, helped by China, by the way, who is absolutely a player in all of this, to go ahead and say, you know what, the time of liberal democracy is past. It's time that we move backwards, which is another element of fascism or Nazism, move backwards away from liberal democracy and the march of civil liberties and progress to actively wrest history backwards in order to create hierarchical structures that are beyond democratic control. It's the same damn thing. And just because people like Tom Nichols don't respect MAGA or Trumpism, and by the way, they would much rather it be done with like a smiling technocratic face. They would much rather that there was a veneer, that there wasn't some buffoon like Donald Trump out there doing it. But guess what? They're fine with the project. They're fine with the idea that strong men are going to go in and put things right. They just want it to be a different strong man. They want it to be their strong man. And for that matter, they want it to be a strong man that they don't have to be embarrassed to support because the rabble over here support them. That's the issue. The issue is that they don't want to be part of a project that they created themselves and they cheerleaded themselves and strategized and pushed forward themselves. George W. Bush, who, by the way, all these people cheerleaded, and I'm sure I haven't even looked today, but I'm sure David Frum has written one of his dumbass columns talking again about this or that or whatever. George W. Bush, who had an election stolen for him and was an aw shucks good old cowboy from Texas, unleashed just an absolutely fascistic assault on the rest of the world that killed unknown amounts of people, upwards of 1,000,000, if not more, with unilateral assaults on other nations that were done under false pretenses in order to open up markets and resources. Fascism and Nazism was a rebirth of colonialism in the exact same way that all of this has been as well. Nazism, fascism, MAGA, Trumpism, all of it are expressions of a white supremacist, oppressionist, capitalistic regime. That's it. So you can sit around, you can argue about what to call it and what not to call it, but what you're doing is you're moving around deck chairs and not talking about the damn ship that's getting ready to go down. Before we finish, I want to say one more word about all of this, which is the missing component. They always say something like, I guess there's two elements to this. One, they're always like, oh, listen, these people are clowns. Nazis and fascists were not clowns. They were absolutely clowns. They were ridiculous. Their conspiracy theories and esoteric ideas were ridiculous. They were constantly engaged in palace intrigue. I mean, my God, they were absolutely dysfunctional. Mussolini did not make the trains run on time. These regimes were ridiculous. The only reasons that they were able to get things done is because they used violence to compel people to at least carry some things out. They were giant messes. Fascists and Nazis are absolutely absurd until they gain power. Until the moment that they move from an absurdity, a clownish buffoon, into a monster. The second thing in all of this that keeps getting lost is that what is happening right now, and I want to try and boil this down as simple as I possibly can, because this is very complicated, but it's true. What is happening right now in the neoliberal crisis, which has made all of this possible, in the same way the capitalist crisis of the early 20th century made fascism and Nazism possible, is that we are reaching a point in which this system is starting to break down and it's going to require authoritarian answers to go ahead and square the circle unless we do something different. Unless we move forward, unless we create something more democratic and more fair, we're going to have to create something less fair and less democratic. Those are the options. That's it. I have told people for years, and I was mocked for this for a while. And any of you who have been on this ride for a while, you know that I was talking about this years ago, that we were going to get to the point where they were going to go after reproductive rights. They were going to start going and trying to make child labor a possibility, that they were going to start destroying history, that they were going to start targeting education, all of this stuff. It has to happen in order to push that project in the authoritarian direction that a lot of people want it to take. Which, by the way, people like Tom Nichols have written articles about how it's okay to go out and attack education. I'm just saying. And by the way, these are all principles that the Republican Party has tried to put a smiling face on until the authoritarian nature needed to come around. The way that that gets squared, and again, I wrote The Midnight Kingdom about this. If you haven't read it, go read it. Whenever we reach a moment when the old mythologies are starting to flag, when they're starting to come apart, you have to find new mythologies. America is in decline. The old idea of the American dream, the forever American century, those things are falling apart. There has to be a new story. The new story that is taking place is not just MAGA, Trumpism, or the authoritarian GOP. It is laced through with a new project that includes national conservatism, This idea that as globalism starts to wind back, we have to focus on the national structure, and also this is what national conservatives are pushing, the idea that there's something special within the white race, which is crypto Nazism for the record. That is the political component. The Christian nationalist component is the spiritual component. And as I wrote about in The Midnight Kingdom, and I wrote about in American Rule, what happens with these fascistic movements is they start to co-opt the existing religious structures. Same thing happened with positive Christianity and the Catholic Church within Italy. You have to take a look at the fact that these people are being told that there's something more meaningful out there than the current system. They're being told that they need to go ahead and commit violence, they need to take over elections, and they need to work harder and sacrifice their own well-being and their families for something larger than themselves. This creation of conflict, this creation of strife, this crisis that is both real and also imagined. And again, that's what all of this is. Some of it is real, some of it is fake. It blends together until it's a perfect fertile ground for this stuff. Christian nationalism is what goes ahead and makes the story in people's heads. It what goes ahead and makes it where they can legitimize what it is that these neo-fascists, neo-Nazis, whatever you want to call them, it goes ahead and legitimizes in their heads what needs to be done. So, in all of these conversations, there's a lack of understanding of what fascism and Nazism are. There is an underestimating of what those things were within the period that they existed, that they didn't find hold in America, where there were millions of fascists and millions of Nazis. Also in Europe, in Great Britain, in France, around the world, these things took hold because they are not just phenomenon that take place in a certain time period or a certain place. They are part of human existence that has to be dealt with. In all of this, there's a misunderstanding of what these people are, how they present themselves, who supports them, but also the role that these things are going to take, including Christian nationalism. We're in a very, very specific moment in the United States of decline. The decline of the United States of America as global hegemon is going to be different than what took place with Great Britain, of course, where there was sort of a brokered transaction with the United States following World War One and World War Two, in which sort of the crown was handed over. And now there's going to be a crisis that is going to bring together all these disparate elements, which again is why I wrote The Midnight Kingdom. The issue now is that America is in decline in a very specific moment in which neoliberal globalism is in peril, right? We have a new Cold War, we have developing climate change, we have economic issues, political, socio-economic issues. We have the consequences of decades of this consolidation of power and wealth. It is going to be very specifically American. But I have to tell you, if we were talking Darwin, if we were talking about species, this is the same species as fascism and Nazism, because these things have always interacted with each other. The Nazis and the fascists took inspiration from the United States of America in the same way the United States of America took inspiration from the Nazis and the fascists, because the main project is white supremacist, patriarchal driven, religious backed, ideologically underpinned capitalism and exploitation. These are absolute relatives of one another. And if these people want to tell themselves stories about what this is and how it works, they're more than free to do it. In the meantime, we need to keep our eye on the ball, and we need to understand that this crisis is real. We need to understand that we do have a role to play in it, and that things can be different, and that they have to be different. But sitting around having these arguments and being browbeat about them, they help no one. This is fascistic. The people involved have fascistic ideologies. There are different spreads of them. Some of them are absolutely aware of fascism. They've been studying Julius Evola. They've been studying Mussolini. They've been studying all of the greatest hits of fascism in order to recreate it and take advantage of this moment. I keep saying it. Donald Trump couldn't give you a definition of fascism if he had to, but he's inherently and instinctually a fascist. There are all different types of people on this scale who are all active in this moment. But we have a very American, very moment specific brand of neo Nazism, neo fascism, authoritarianism, whatever you want to call it. These arguments, they obscure the larger condition. All right, everybody. I'm going to go finish my coffee. Hope this helps. Stay safe out there.